My name is Juan Pablo Córdoba. I'm the CEO of the Colombian Securities Exchange, and we are very glad to host you today. We have a very exciting morning for you with the latest updates on what's going on in Colombia and with our corporations. As you know, Colombia Inside Out started almost a decade ago, precisely as a reach out program to have a conversation face-to-face with investors about what's going on in Colombia and with our listed companies. The fact that we are here today, despite the circumstances, is a testament of our commitment to be here precisely in a virtual form, but face-to-face with all of you, and to have provide for you a first-hand opportunity to get involved in what's going on in the country and with our companies. Colombia in the past has proven to be a very resilient country under different circumstances and under different crises. And I am certain that this will not be an exception in what the world is facing today. A lot of this resilience has to do with the quality and commitment of our corporations. Most of the ones that we have had in this Colombia Inside Out, all of our listed corporations, and their commitment to development and to continue to grow and invest in our country. As a testament to that commitment, the World Economic Forum recognized Colombia this year as one of the top 10 countries, for example, in sustainability reporting. Our corporations have been really committed to this goal, and we are disclosing, many of our companies are disclosing, more than 30 of our companies are disclosing precisely all their sustainability goals, but not just the disclosure, but the commitments that they are making. So we are very confident that even in these times, this commitment will continue. Also, this resilience has been supported by a tradition of a very sound and prudent policy framework that has prepared Colombia to be able to sustain its macroeconomic growth above its peers in the region throughout history. And this year, this will not be an exception. And this policy framework will also prepare us for what's coming in the future. The combination of these two things, I'm sure, will make us stronger, and companies will come out stronger from this crisis. I'm sure that that sustainability commitment will be strengthened. We see companies now being very focused on digital transformation. I'm certain also that the financial strategies and structures of these companies will improve as we come out of the crisis. And I'm sure that there will be more improvements in productivity and logistics for the economy as a whole and for our company, or for our companies. We have a very exciting morning for you. We have the opening remarks by our Director of Public Credit, Mr. Cesar Arias, who will give you a framework of precisely the policy framework and financing strategy of the country. And then we have two panels that I think are very relevant for you, our investors and the investor community. So I hope this is a good opportunity for you to learn more of what's going on in Colombia. And we thank you very much for joining us. And also we would like to thank our partners and sponsors in this event. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Juan. Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning, everyone. So a year ago, I had the opportunity of opening the 8th Colombia Inside Out in front of the Colombian president. Now, this year, the circumstances have changed, and this has led us to move the event virtually. These are very challenging times for the world, and we're seeing economic repercussions of the pandemic everywhere. Key will be how every single government will intervene through stimulus and support the economies, but also how the corporates will adjust and fine-tune their business model. The president of Colombia and his team have been quite proactive in tackling the economic issues with fiscal stimulus and taking decisive steps around the fiscal rule that will allow extra flexibility for the economy. That's why this event couldn't come at a better timing. It's a great value for Citigroup and our partners, the Colombia Exchange, but also the investor community, to have the opportunity to hear directly from the senior management of the Colombian listed names and sharing their insights on how they're coping and what their future plans are. As Warren Buffett once said, never let a good crisis go to waste. We've seen how consumers are adapting to this new environment with more digital ways emerging in a way that will require innovations, and our investors will shape their investments accordingly. So once again, we're very proud of hosting and sponsoring our friends, and I'd like to thank Yuan and the Colombia Exchange for our partnership, and also all the corporates and investors for their interest and commitment. Thank you.
I think we're on. Operator?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So welcome everyone. Thank you, Juan Pablo. Thank you, Michaela, for those opening remarks. We're joined today by Public Credit Director Cesar Arias. Thanks a lot for your time join us today. What we're going to do is just have a quick opening statement with the Public Credit Director, and then we'll follow up with a session of questions. So without further ado, let me pass it over to Mr. Arias. Again, thanks for your time.
Thank you very much. Give me 1 second, I put my presentation on. Well, on behalf of the Ministry of Finance of Colombia, we want to thank the invitation of the Colombia Stock Exchange, also the Citibank for hosting us, and particularly thanks to everybody, all the investors and opinion makers that are connected through Zoom for this opportunity to discuss a presentation that we have prepared for you, and we have called it Colombia Macroeconomic Strengths and Investment Opportunities. So the presentation has 2 parts. In the first one, we realized that it is very important to convey to investors that in times of volatility, like the ones that we are experiencing, Colombia remains a country that has very strong anchors for macroeconomic stability. And in the second part, we're going to be discussing some investment opportunities in the post-COVID era. So without further preliminary words, let's get to the presentation. The first anchor that you have when you look at Colombia from an investment perspective is that Colombia is a very dynamic and resilient growth economy. This chart on the left shows you that clearly over the last 24 months, Colombia has been outperforming all other Latin American investment grade peers in the region. Colombia is growing faster than Peru, Chile, Brazil, Uruguay, and Mexico. In the blue line, you see the performance in 2019, but what is also interesting is to see the orange bar, which is the performance in the first quarter of 2020. And you see that Colombia with Chile were the only ones that were in green in the first quarter. That already takes into account 2 to 3 weeks of pandemic, and it outperforms all other economies like Peru, Uruguay, and Mexico that are actually already in a contraction when the crisis hit. The second thing that I like to show is this heat map on the left. This heat map on the left divides the economy by sector. We have 12 sectors in the economy. And with the information that we have for the first quarter, we can report that 8 of the 12 economic sectors are still growing positively in the first 3 months of this year. Particularly, we see how agriculture is an important sector in green. It grew almost 7% in real terms. Public administration grew 3.4% in real terms. And we have 4 sectors that are growing negatively: construction, mining, entertainment, and slightly manufacturing. But as you see, these sectors have a lower share of GDP in the economy. On the right-hand side, we also see how Colombia is adjusting. The negative news is that we were driving a very investment-led recovery, which is that gray line on the right-hand side. But unfortunately, it was investment-related sectors that actually took the first hit during the pandemic, and it was only cushioned by the performance of consumption. The third thing that I would like to say is that Colombia was a leader in Latin America in imposing very strict measures, very strict lockdowns during the early part of the pandemic, but it was also a leader in the region in starting the gradual reopening of the economy. On the left-hand side, you have the dates, different periods of the pandemic, and the level of openness of the production capacity of the economy. And you saw that even during the most stringent times, the production capacity of the economy was open at something between 65 and 70%. And gradually towards mid-June, we're recovering, at least in production capacity, at 90%. So we're expecting to see the economy revamping its full capacity in the second half of 2020. One of my favorite indicators, because it's a real-time indicator, is the level of demand for energy. And this indicator really doesn't lie. What you see there is during the early months of January, February, we had very similar levels of energy demand that we have last year. This line shows the inter-year growth. And you saw how during the most strict time of the lockdown, energy demand contracted by 34%. 34%. But you see that as the lockdown measures ease, we're gradually recovering this energy demand. Already in early May, we had energy demand growing close to 8%. And as you see in the chart, today we have energy demand growing year on year at a level of 6%. Another thing that facilitates not only the dynamism of growth, but the resilience of growth is actually Colombia's economy flexible exchange rate. And we have two pieces of evidence to show you. The first one is the chart on the left. One of the main vulnerabilities of the Colombian economy is the current account deficit. And what you see there is that this tool of the flexible exchange rate has helped to undertake a gradual and orderly adjustment of the current account deficit. It is impressive how we moved from having a current account deficit of $3.5 billion towards the end of last year to having a current account deficit of $2.7 billion in the first quarter of 2020. And really, the maintenance of macroeconomics worked very well in Colombia. What you had is basically a contraction in primary income, another way of saying profit repatriation. Companies have this automatic stabilizer that make them to repatriate less capital during contractions. Imports started to contract, and that's why you see a narrower trade deficit. And then you see that steel services and transfers perform poorly. Not surprisingly, in services, what you have a lot is tourism. And in transfers, although remittances perform relatively well, we have some one-off operations in the insurance industry that actually turned that to negative. But you see how in an orderly fashion, the economy is self-adjusting to a lower equilibrium of a lower current account deficit. One of my favorite charts is the chart on the right. Actually, I have drawn this chart for several other countries. What happens is that Colombia has only had one recession in 40 years. We will probably have a second recession in 2020 in a period of 40 years. But what you have there is how the Colombian economy absorbs shocks and how it recovers. And this brings out the typical discussion between a U-shape or a V-shape recovery. So what you see there is that the only recession that Colombia has had in 40 years, in the year 1999, what we had, it was a very nicely shaped V recovery. We took 4 quarters to go down and touch bottom, and we have the same 4 quarters to come back even in the third quarter, we already recovered. And this was the shape of the recovery of the 1999 recession. And then you see, for example, the global financial crisis. In the global financial crisis, which is the red line, you see that we actually didn't fall into recession, but the recovery was very L-shaped. So we fell during 4 quarters and then sort of stagnated for 3 quarters and finally came back in the fourth quarter. And the other 2 lines that you have there is the purple and the green line are basically oil shocks. And you see that the oil shocks are very shallow and the economy actually adjusts very well thanks to this flexible exchange rate tool that we have. So we still have a lot of uncertainty on how it's going to be the shape of the recovery this time around, but if the past is a good indication of the future, we should be able to recover more like the V shape of the 1999 rather than the L shape of the 2009. The second anchor is that Colombia traditionally is very conservative and very prudent in the response to shocks. And here, what I want to show is that we have designed an emergency response package that is bold enough to tackle the challenges that we have, but that is prudent enough to prevent that this fiscal response is actually jeopardizing either macroeconomic stability or fiscal sustainability. And the way we do it is the following. When you add it up, the fiscal response package is around 11% of GDP. But when you see the composition, you will see that only a third of that package is actually a fiscal injection. As you see there in the chart on the left, we have designed a rapid response package of 3% of GDP, 3.1% of GDP. This is actual cash that comes to the treasury, to the economy. And it's basically disbursed in thirds, 1/3 for health, sanitary emergency, 1/3 for vulnerable populations. We have different levels of vulnerable populations, young, elderly, kids, and informals. And we have 1/3 of an employment protection scheme that we have designed during this emergency. Another 3% is actually liquidity provision, but it doesn't have a fiscal cost in the sense that this liquidity provision is led by the central bank. And they have injected this liquidity into the economy through repo facilities, through bond purchases, and also to the cut of reserve requirements. And finally, we have another component of the rapid response package, which is credit guarantees. And credit guarantees is a very interesting mechanism because although you don't disburse money upfront, because you're just guaranteeing credit through the financial system, it is true that you have a contingent liability dependent on the credit quality of these credits. So when you add up the 3.1, the 3%, and the 4.8%, we get to an 11% emergency response package, which is generally smaller than in other countries, but every country counts it differently. But what we want to convey here is that we're tackling this problem through 3 different facilities, one that is cash, another that is maintaining the liquidity and the well-functioning of capital markets, and finally, through credit guarantees to reduce these asymmetries of information that we're having in the credit market. That is that although there is liquidity, there is very little appetite for risk. This has increased our financing needs. Our financing needs, we started with a deficit target of 2.2% of GDP early in the year. And in the latest meetings with the Independent Fiscal Council, that level of the deficit has been widened to levels around 6.1%, 6.1%. And what we want to tell you is that from the treasury perspective, that is the main part of our job, we have applied a principle of diversification of financing sources. And on the left, you see that 36% of those financing needs have been covered through domestic bond issuance, another 20% through multilateral lending, 16% through international bonds, 16% to public sector savings. We were able to draw down on surplus funds that we had in the public sector, for example, the Oil Stabilization Fund, the Regional Pension Fund, and another 12% through the issuance of solidarity bonds with the cuts in reserve requirements that the central bank applied to commercial banks. And this strategy of diversification has had a very positive response in the market. Approximately 3 or 4 weeks ago, we issued international bonds in global markets, and we were able to do 2 things. First, as you see in the chart on the right, we were able to place these bonds at the longest tenors possible. So we sort of differentiated with respect to other sovereigns that prefer the tenors of 5 years and 10 years. We actually disproportionately rely on funding at the 31-year sector, and we were able to lock in the lowest coupon in Colombian history at 31 years, which is the coupon of 4.2 that you see in that slide on the right. And we compare that coupon with all the coupons that we have issued at the 30-year, and it's significant to see that our coupons have been coming down from 7.5% to 4.2%. But this positive response from the market has been also reflected in our local assets. When you see copy performance, our Colombian peso, you will see that, of course, during March is widened, is the red line, the dotted red line. But you see how Colombia, at the beginning, was performing very similar to Brazil, very similar to Mexico. And then, starting in mid-March, it outperforms Brazil, it outperforms Mexico, and it even outperforms Uruguay. Of course, this still trades wider than Chile and Peru, but you have to understand that Chile and Peru, of course, has 1 or 2 notches difference in terms of credit quality. On the right, you will see our coltes, our local currency bonds. The gray line, sorry, the black line is the yield curve pre-COVID, right there in January. And then you see how during the peak of the emergency in mid-March, the yield curve went up significantly. But the black line tells you that basically all the sell-off that we have in March has been fully recovered by early June. Of course, the curve has steepened, and it has steepened because of 2 things. One is the fact that the market hadn't anticipated the aggressive cuts by the central bank in the short end of the curve, and on the long end of the curve is reflecting the fiscal expansion and the discussions that we're having in terms of fiscal policy. The main scars that we're gonna have after all this process is a significant increase in the debt burden. We want to be very transparent about this. It's a debt burden is basically gonna go up from 50% of GDP to something around 65, 66% of GDP in a matter of a year. This is very comparable with the IMF estimations. IMF estimates that all emerging markets on average are gonna increase its fiscal deficits by 4.5% of GDP, and those that are commodity exporters are going to increase is debt to GDP, is fiscal deficit by 7%. And in terms of debt, the debt burdens of the emerging world are going to increase between 10 to 15% of GDPs. We are uncomfortable with that level because we have a parametric limit, more than a legal limit, is a parametric limit that tells us that when you hit that 60% of GDP threshold, you should start a very accelerated and determined step of reducing the debt burden. So when the information that we're having now, and we're recalibrating it, we're already forecasting that we can reduce the debt burden by 4 percentage points next year if we have a higher recovery, and also if we start consolidating the fiscal deficit towards and more normalized times after the pandemic. And the third anchor of macroeconomic stability is that Colombia has, unlike other countries in the region and in emerging markets, a very stable political landscape and a very strong institutional setting. I don't want to talk a lot about politics, but what I can tell you is that the single most important factor when the pandemic ends is going to be the capacity of governments to implement reforms, corrective reforms, through Congress and through its relationship with the judiciary. Here in this slide, what I have on the left side is the 6 economic bills that we tabled to Congress since we came to government in August 2018. We have submitted to Congress 6 economic bills, and all of them has been passed. And what you have there is the share of favorable versus unfavorable votes. And what I can tell you is that all of them has been passed at least with a 2/3 majority, both in the plenary of the House and the plenary of the Senate. In some cases, it's even more than 2/3. And these laws, as you will see in the chart, are the national budget of 2019, the national budget of 2020, fiscal reform in 2018, a second fiscal reform, tax reform in 2019, the National Development Plan, and the reform, which was a constitutional reform to the royalty system. So what I want to convey is that Colombia, different to other countries, has a broader consensus on the maintenance of macroeconomic stability, and that is reflected on incremental reforms in Congress. I agree with you. Most of these reforms are not structural, foundational, but they have taken a very pragmatic and incremental approach to improving particular elements of our policy making. And the second thing that is encouraging is that even at the early part of the stage of this pandemic, the president undertook a very tactical cabinet reshuffle that broadened our representation of the government coalition in Congress from 50% to 60%. And this came out basically with the inclusion in the government coalition of this radical change, Cambio Radical party, that was previously independent and that now is part of the government coalition. And is so part of the government coalition that actually the Ministry of Health is perceived to be as the representation of this party. So when this emergency abates, again, it's going to be very important to evaluate as an investor the capacity of the political class, of the democratic institutions to deliver reforms and corrective measures. And we think that Colombia is well positioned to take advantage of its long-standing tradition of incremental change of economic reforms. Let's talk about the second part of the presentation, which is the investment opportunities post-COVID. I have identified three main areas of opportunity for foreign and domestic investors. The first one is fixed income markets. Colombia has one of the deepest and most liquid government debt markets in emerging markets. As you see there, our local currency bond markets are around 30% of GDP. We consider that this is an optimal size. It's not as small as in Indonesia, Turkey, or Russia, that has domestic markets of around between 10 and 20%. But it's not over-exaggerated with countries that have a very, very heavy load of debt, like Hungary, South Africa, and Brazil. We are more in the league of the premium emerging markets in terms of bonds. Mexico has 31% of GDP, Thailand 31% of GDP, and India a similar percentage. We have two curves that are liquid there. The most liquid one is the one on the left. You see on the blue bars our benchmarks. These are benchmarks of around, I would say, $10 billion on average in fixed income. And it's a curve that we're in the process of even extended from 15 years to 30 years. But we have also working on the development and standardization of our inflation linker curve, that, as you see on the right side, is less homogeneous, but we're working to take it to the level that we have in the fixed income, in the fixed rate level. There is a feature that makes our domestic bond market more stable than others, and is that we have no dominant players in the market. As you see in the left-hand side of the slide, we have a very diverse distribution of holdings. Pension funds have 30% of the market, foreign funds have 23% of the market, commercial banks 17%, public sector trust 14%, and other areas in the financial sector 10%. And this facilitates the trading during the good time, but especially during the bad times. And we have seen how the Colombian market has performed really well, even during March. It is easy to get in the Colombian market, but it's easy also to get out of the Colombian market. We don't have capital controls. We have a very business-friendly approach to these flows. And we basically, even within these foreign funds of 20%, we have a very diverse distribution of holdings across the world. You will see, for example, that look what is happening in continental Europe. 2 years ago, continental Europe accounted for 40% of our holdings of Colombian TES. With the Colombian accession as a full member of the OECD, those holdings have increased to almost 46% of GDP. And we have been working on increasing the holdings in South America, increasing the holdings in Canada, as you see there, and maintaining a good participation in Asia. On the left-hand side, you will see that our returns in the test curve. You have seen that, not surprisingly, despite all the volatility between the short part of the curve and the middle part of the curve, the returns have been in the double digits territory. And of course, given the steepening, the returns have been lower in the longer part of the curve, but nonetheless positive. And one of my favorite charts is also the chart on the right, because it's not only, if we have had this talk 2 or 3 years ago, the dominance of the government in the domestic bond market is significant, still is, but what you're seeing now, and probably the CEO of the stock exchange can talk about this, is that there are more and more non-government issuers emerging. We have on the right-hand side the level of issuance and the new participants in Colombian bond markets in local currency. And over there you see securitizations, you see domestic banks, you see corporates, and you also see subnationals, for example, the District of Bogota. The second thing that I see as an opportunity is that one of our main achievements as a government is the capacity to attract foreign direct investment. This is a very important chart. In 2019, foreign direct investment grew in nominal terms 25%. This means $3.5 billion in additional FDI came into Colombia last year. And what is more important is that non-oil or non-mining FDI is growing at double the rate of oil mining FDI. And when you compare Colombia across emerging markets in investment grade territory, we outperform Peru, Thailand, Hungary, Philippines, India. And in annualized way, we were able to attract more than 4% of GDP in foreign direct investment. And down there, you will see the sectors that have been benefiting from this foreign direct investment push. And you see things like finance and business, you see oil, you see retail, restaurants and hotels, you see manufacturing, transportation, construction. And you will think that this was an issue of 2019, but thankfully we got the data from the first quarter of 2020. And in the first quarter of 2020, you see that despite the slowdown from the pandemic, foreign direct investment grew 6% year on year. And the growth of other sectors was 22% and more than offset the fall in oil and mining FDI. This is very important. We just gonna give two examples of two sectors that were very dynamic in terms of FDI. The first one was electricity, gas, and water. So utilities is a sector that is performing really well in the Colombian economy. And what is called community social services, as we will see in the next slide, you will see that the performance of health, for example, of education, of some of those services is performing really well. This is a very interesting slide. What I wanted to bring here is the landmark investment transactions during the last 18 months in Colombia. And I'm just gonna go through some of them in the interest of time. For example, SoftBank invested in Rappi, which is in the technology sector. This is a Japanese company, and it is planned to invest $1 billion. We have, for example, another example of these issues of health. You have United Health investing in Banmédica, an American company coming to Colombia for $342 million. We have a Peruvian company, Primax, buying a significant part of the gas stations in the main cities and in Colombia for $200 million. And you will see there, for example, China Harboring, investing in Metro Bogota, in the first line of the metro that we're going to have in Colombia for an early investment of $260 million. So you will see there that it is diversifying not only in the sectors, technologies, utilities, health, infrastructure, but also in terms of the investors, the nationalities of these investors. You have there North American, Europeans, Asians, and Latin American counterparts. Finally, one sector that I would think is going to be called to be the most important one in the recovery of the Colombian economy is infrastructure. What I have there in front of you is the Infrascope ranking for Latin America and the Caribbean. You will see that Colombia ranked first in 2017 and now ranks second in the latest update that the Intelligence Economy Unit did of this ranking. This is a sample of almost 20 countries. And there are a couple of strengths that our infrastructure frame will have. The first one is the legal framework. The legal framework, I'm not going to go into the details, but I can tell you that we have a standardized contract for concessions, especially toll roads, that we have designed a Chapter 11 for infrastructure in Colombia. This is probably the first Chapter 11 that we have in Latin America, and it brought about after the scandals that you have in other jurisdictions with the companies like Odebrecht. So now it is clear and certain in Colombia what happens when, for example, corruption hits a consortium and you have to orderly dissolve that consortium and rebuild it. We have significant innovations in terms of markets. Colombia has 3 debt infrastructure funds with counterparts like Ashmore, CAF, BlackRock, Credit Corp, and we have 1 equity infrastructure fund that is being funded through CDPQ, and to my understanding, there is another one that is closely to be announced soon. We have started to introduce features like the mini-perm, securitizations, a standalone project finance. We have issue bonds in inflation linkers and linked to dollars, and we're working on providing facilities to provide funding in local currency. Finally, I think what is more important is that we have 2 markets in infrastructure. We have a primary market. Out of 30 concessions, we have already made financial closings for sort of half of them, financial closings for $7.8 billion, but we have already $7 billion still to be closed. So that's what we call the primary market of infrastructure. As a whole, this is something like 4.5% of GDP. You will see on the right that the financing sources for these projects have diversified significantly. In 2016, local commercial banks accounted for 50% of the financing. Today, local commercial banks only account for 26% of the financing, and you have, for example, 35% from international banks, bonds, debt funds, and equity funds. And this is the last slide, but I think it's very important, because what you have emerging in Colombia is a secondary market of infrastructure. All these concessions that you have there on the left side, a dozen of infrastructure concessions that have achieved more than 50% of execution, are now being sold into the secondary markets. We already completed a transaction there in the second one, Cartagena Barranquilla, and we're expecting to see more movement in this pipeline of transactions that are abating construction risk and that could be put and diversifying the market. So the secondary market for infrastructure in Colombia measures almost $5 billion, close to 1.5% of GDP. And finally, we're launching with the Minister of Transportation what is called the 5th generation of infrastructure products. 2 things to say there, and we can talk more in the Q&A session. The first one is the size. We're talking about $5 billion, another 1.6% of GDP. The second is that we're moving from traditionally infrastructure in Colombia meant toll roads. Now we're talking about airports, river navigation, and rail. The projects are listed there, and these we think are important opportunities that there is no more important sector than infrastructure in the recovery stage of the Colombian economy. So sorry I overstepped a little bit of time, but I wanted to give you the best possible color, Esteban. So I turn it over to you for moderation. Thank you.
No worries at all. I can thank you very much for your time with that presentation. We have like 10 minutes, so I've received several questions. I'm gonna lump them up in topics, and we can go that way since we're not that ample on time. Some topics have come up in the past couple of weeks, and we are soon to receive from the Ministry of Finance the medium-term fiscal plan. So of course, we can't discuss that yet, hopefully soon. But in the meantime, we have news. The Fiscal Rule Committee last weekend approved suspending the fiscal rule And we have several questions coming in on that topic. One is, are your deficit estimates changing a lot? And of course, we'll have more information in the medium-term plan, more due to revenues being lower, or is there a new fiscal package being planned that could potentially widen the deficit? That's one. And another question we'll ask on the fiscal rule is this new committee that is being proposed, which is the old committee turning into an oversight panel. Will they have oversight powers to actually control decisions, or will it just be an oversight panel giving commentary and guiding fiscal policy alone?
Thank you. I wanted to show you. I will say the two things to start. The first one is that I don't know if you're seeing my presentation, the slide, Esteban?
Not yet.
Not yet. But basically, I'm having trouble, technological trouble. But you see me and hear me.
Yes, perfectly.
Okay. So what I would say is two things. I'm trying to show you a slide, but look, the suspension and the use of escape clauses in fiscal rules is not only an issue affecting Colombia, is an issue that is being affecting all countries. I'm trying to show you a slide in which, as you know, the European Union activated a suspension of the fiscal deficits recently for all the EU members. The same thing has been recommended by the OECD. In the region, Peru, for example, has suspended the fiscal rule the same way as Colombia for 2020 and 2021. And we have other countries at the same level of ratings like Indonesia, India, Czech Republic, making use of these escape clauses. Unfortunately, my thing froze, but I'm glad that you still hear me. What is going to happen with the deficit? Look, what we know as of now is that we started from 2.2% of GDP and we moved to 6.1% of GDP. It is clearly not enough, the 6.1% of GDP, and that was the reason guiding the suspension of the fiscal rule. Now, as you mentioned, I cannot tell you exactly the number right now that we're going to have for 2020. In a week and a half, we're going to present the medium-term fiscal framework to the public opinion as is mandated by law. So in that fiscal framework, we're going to announce not only the deficit target for 2020, but also for 2021, 22, and the 10 years after. This is an exercise of 10 years of fiscal planning. What I can tell you is that we are learning more and more about this crisis. And what I can tell you is that in the first stage, where you are more worried is how much is going to be the size of the spending shock. And we more or less started with an estimation of something like 2% of GDP, and we will probably end something closer to 3% of GDP in terms of the cash needed to do extra spending in health, in vulnerable populations, in protection of employment. Once you have managed that spending shock, the second derivative of the shock is more difficult to quantify because it's going to be the revenue shortfall that you have due to the economic contraction. And in that sense, we started with a forecast of a revenue shortfall in taxation of 1% of GDP, and is looking that that level of the shortfall in revenues due to the economic contraction is probably gonna be closer to 2% or a little bit more of GDP. Okay, so we're gonna have a combined shock on spending of 3% of GDP, let's put it this way, and on revenues of 2% of GDP. And that's what we're trying to preventively finance through our different sources that we have achieved. On your latest question about the role of the committee, we want to convey the following. You can make use of the escape clauses. You can suspend the rule. This is completely legal. It's incorporated in the fiscal rule. But in the press release, that was the conclusion of that meeting between the fiscal rule committee and the government, there were, I would say, 3 conditionalities that were very strict. First conditionality, you have to announce in the medium-term fiscal framework the clear path for fiscal policy. Second conditionality, you have to do 2 types of policies to restore to the parameters of the fiscal rule in 2022. First, you have to rationalize spending, particularly subsidies policies that need to be better targeted and more efficient. And second, the country needs to increase its revenue income in order to preserve the long-term sustainability of public finances. And the third conditionality is that the press release says you have to include an article in the budget law that we will submit to Congress in July and will be approved in October, that gives force to this independent fiscal rule committee to play a role of overseer and to check the quarterly reports that by law the government will have to submit in order to follow up on the policies while the rule is suspended. So when you read the press release, you will see that it was purposely designed to incorporate this even in the budget law that we're going to submit to Congress later in the year.
Thank you. So we're running a little bit short on time, and this is a topic that I'm getting a bunch of questions on. So we have around 5 minutes for an answer, and it's on the topic of pensions. There's a couple of things going on. Of course, the possibility of a bill with withdrawals that came up last week, the bill that is going on in Congress right now about a move from the private system to the public system for a certain number of individuals, and finally pension reform, which has been a big pillar or plan from the government, which is scheduled or was scheduled for this year. So on just a quick comment on the first 2 topics, and then on pension reform, is it still in the pipeline, and is the possibility of a tax reform gaining weight that could potentially postpone the pension reform in favor of a tax reform over the next year or so?
Thank you. In the interest of time, I'm going to try to be as quick as possible. The first one, on the potential use of pension money to be withdrawn by pensioners or contributors to spend during the pandemic, I think the President of the Republic cleared that debate. The President, Iván Duque, is opposed to that approach to fiscal policy, and I think that solved that debate last week. So all the options were studied through this process, but I think the President of the Republic has been very clear in saying that it is not the responsible thing to do to spend the savings of the pensioners and contributors today and create a problem tomorrow. I particularly subscribe to that same opinion of the president. Pension reform is in the pipeline. Yes, I think pension reform is not a problem of if, but when. Unfortunately, we have had to postpone it 2 times. The first one was last year at the end of the year, because the Constitutional Court asked us to repass the tax reform, and it is difficult to pass a tax and a pension reform at the same time. And in the first legislature of this year, we were also going to submit it, but the pandemic came, and actually Congress was not in service for several months early in the year. So what I will tell you is that it is a priority for the Ministry of Finance. It is a priority for the president, and we will get it to Congress when the time comes. It is a reform that looks to increase fiscal income? No, it is a reform that seeks to achieve 2 objectives. 1, increase coverage. Only 1 in 4 Colombians that are in retirement age have access to pensions, and that is unsustainable. And 2, there is a need to make more progressive the distribution of subsidies between the different incomes of the population. Today, it is very regressive. The largest part of the population is actually financing the subsidies of the richest part of the pensioners. So those 2 objectives have been publicly announced that are going to be driving this pension reform. And in the issue of tax reform, I repeat again, it is an issue of when more than if, in the sense that we have to be careful, and the president has stated publicly that doing tax reforms in the middle of a pandemic is probably not the right approach to do it. But once the dust settles, I think that the country, and given what we discussed on the Fiscal Rule Committee, will have to start having that discussion.
Great. And let me just sneak in a quick question on support for the airline industry that has also been discussed recently. There was support at the beginning of the pandemic. Has that moved along?
Yes, I would say two things that are important on that topic. First, we're not helping particular companies, but we are gonna support a broad-based package for the industry, especially in the sense that this is a strategic sector for the reactivation of the economy. 2, it is very important to see that 2 of the main airlines have filed for bankruptcy proceedings in the United States. And this facilitates the role of the government, because it actually make very clear and very concrete that what comes out of these rulings gives you more certainty on the extent and the depth of the package that will be needed.
Understood. And with that, we'll start wrapping up our conversation. I want to thank you, Mr. Arias, for your time. Quite informative in a very relevant time. Thank you for joining us through this webcast. We're coming on from everywhere. Our next panel is oil and gas, led by our oil and gas analyst, Pedro Medeiros, out of Brazil. So we're joining you from all across the world. Everyone listening, thank you for your time as well. I hope you found this informative. If there's any further questions, either for me or Mr. Arias, we'll see how we can manage those. And sorry we couldn't get to all of them. Thanks a lot for your time. I wish you a wonderful day, and I hope you're all staying safe.
Thank you very much, and thank you for this opportunity to the stock exchange, to Citibank, and to this forum of Colombia Inside Out. I hope it was informative, and we're happy to respond any other questions that some of the investors have through other channels.
Thanks again.
On behalf of City.
You are in the meeting now.
Now we go. Okay, good morning, everyone. I have the pleasure to moderate the next panel. On behalf of City, well, to start with, I would like to thank BBC for the invite, our speakers for their presence here today with us, and the audience for joining us in this virtual conference. Our next panel is to discuss Colombia's energy business. We will have an hour for that. The format is very simple. I'll be asking questions, and let us start with a quick remark from each one of the speakers about the latest news and a quick overview of their companies. I would like to remind everyone as well that if you want to post a question, I'll be polling them through my email, pedro.medeiros@city.com, and we should have time to place them in our panel by the end. Okay, so let me quickly introduce our speakers. Okay, I'll start with Ms. Marcela Vaca, who is Geoparks Director for Colombia since August 2012, where she led the discovery of 10 large fields and significant expansion in the company's operated production. She has a long industry experience with management positions held prior in GHK and Hupecol, where she was involved with the development of fields, pipeline construction, assets development, financing, and sales strategy. Okay. Moving on, we also have Mr. Eric Flesch, who's the CEO of Promigas, leading a group of 17 companies involved in transport and distribution of natural gas, marketing power in Colombia and Peru. Eric was also prior the president of Argos Corporation in the United States, where he served multiple positions for over 39 years. We also have with us Mr. Charlie Gamba, who's the CEO of Canacol Energy, a company that he founded in 2008. He has held a variety of technical and management roles in companies such as Occidental, Alberta Energy, Canadian Occidental, and Imperial Oil, mostly focused on exploration and production in South America, but with a long experience as well internationally in countries like Qatar, US, Australia, Indonesia, and Canada. And lastly, we have Mr. Felipe Bayon, who's the CEO of Ecopetrol Group, the largest energy conglomerate in Colombia and the fourth most important oil and gas player in Latin America. Mr. Bayon has over 26 years of experience in the oil and gas industry, previously served as Ecopetrol's COO, with an extensive management experience as well in BP's Colombia and its international operations. Okay, with that, let me ask, please, Marcela, to start with some quick initial remarks, and we'll be handing over to each of the panelists before we jump to questions. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you, and ladies first. Thank you. Well, thanks. First of all, for inviting us to this panel and with this great colleagues. We are in Geopark absolutely focused on protecting not only our employees, but our contractors, and we're doing all sorts of things to keep them safe. first of all, both in the field and in the office, and manage to be overlooking their well-being. And that is by far a priority. Geopart was the first company in Colombia in the oil industry to be awarded the Safeguard certificate by Bureau Veritas, and that included an audit in all of our processes, testing, protocols, everything. So security-wise, we are in absolute compliance with all our protocols and absolutely focused on keeping everybody safe. And then in the business, we'll take care of the business as we will discuss later. Thank you, Pedro. We can't hear you.
Sorry, I put myself on mute. Eric, could you please take over and I don't know if you want to start with any remark. Eric, you're on mute as well.
Yeah, thank you, Pedro.
There you go.
Yeah, thank you very much. Promigas is a company leader in Colombia in gas transport and distribution. We transport about 52% of the gas for the whole country. And during this situation of COVID that we are facing worldwide, we just have two main focus. First, to preserve the health of our employees, and with all the compliance of all the protocols, supplying all the PPEs and make sure our employees and even their families are in good shape. And we are tracking them day by day and one by one, all over 3,000 people we have. Also, we decided as a contribution to our society in Colombia, but also to our employees, not to reduce one headcount. Just we haven't laid off anyone, and we feel very proud of that. Also another main focus for the company was to guarantee to ensure the normal operation to render the best service to our customers, residential, commercial, and industrial. So they haven't noticed any difference, even though that almost 80% of our employees are working home office. So everything so far has been great. We've been working normally and just giving to the country the best support during this situation. So we feel very proud of that.
Thank you. Charles, let me move to you next, and to Canacol.
Thank you, Pedro, and welcome to all the viewers. As any other company operating in Colombia, we've obviously taken precautions, all of the necessary precautions with respect to employee safety, especially those regulations implemented by the federal, provincial, and municipal governments related to workplace health and health in our operations. I'm glad to say that so far things have been working very well. We've been focusing to ensure the smooth operation of our production facilities so that we can continue to deliver gas to our clients without any interruptions. On the business front, obviously, the year started out very well with respect to gas sales. We're a gas-focused company here in Colombia. We saw gas sales countrywide increase about 2% compared to 2019. And then during the crisis, of course, with the quarantine and the immobilization of many of the major economic sectors in the country, we saw gas demand fall by about 19% compared to 2019 during the months of April and May. Fortunately, we've seen a bit of a recovery. So far through June, gas demand has recovered to a level about 6% below 2019 averages. So we're starting to see a bit of a recovery in gas. But the important thing for us is to make sure that our operations are running very smoothly so we can continue to deliver gas to our main customers.
Perfect. Okay. And Felipe.
Pedro, morning, and thanks for having me. And it's great to be here with my colleagues. And first thing is that at Ecopetrol, we've put as our first priority the health and safety of our employees. So when we started back in March, very quickly implemented the pandemic response plan, and I've been very proactively doing that. And I know we'll probably talk about this a bit more. Working remotely, most of us, 85% of our workforce, and then ensuring that the people that need to be working in the fields, in the pipelines, in the product lines, in the refineries, in the ports, are able to do that. And I think probably the first reflection is that in this sector, we've been part of the backbone of keeping the country running, you know, in terms of providing the gas, the energy, the fuels. Even though we've seen, as Charlie was saying, a reduction not only in gas demand, we've seen a reduction in jet, diesel, gasoline. We've had to take our refineries runs down significantly by over 40% over the last few months. We've seen some recovery. And I think the key here is how do we are able to operate safely and efficiently and responsibly in the midst of an unprecedented crisis, something that we have never seen before in humanity, that nobody's an expert on COVID-19 still. We don't have definitive answers in terms of how this will be resolved, but we need to deal with uncertainty, and we need to ensure that we can provide those fundamental services, you know, as Eric and Marcela and Charlie were saying, that the country needs, so we don't stop the country, and we ensure that even though this is going to be a very, very big crisis, we can recover as quickly as we can. And again, thanks, Pedro, for the invite.
Okay, well, thanks. Well, thank you everyone for those remarks. So the first question is it kind of blends into some of your comments, okay? It's a very general and open question, but basically, as you pointed out, Felipe, we're trying to understand in an unprecedented type of crisis, how are each of your companies reacting to the crisis, right? We talked a bit about the drop in consumption, but can you, each one of you, please comment a little bit further on how you're reacting internally, what kind of actions are being taken, and anything that you want to highlight about how the company is being managed and going through this, well, let's say unique or unseen type of crisis in the past many years. So let me start again with the same order, okay? Maybe Marcela, could you start again, and we'll move all the way to Felipe. And you are on mute, okay?
As Felipe mentioned, this is probably the most challenging times that we all have faced, and not only in the business, but it's just in our families, in our social life. It is really of such a magnitude that I don't think we saw this coming at any stage. I mean, we've seen, and for those that have been in the business for a while, that I'm sure you have been in the business for longer than I am, but the oil crisis have been usually just the oil business crisis, they have usually involved a few industries. This is like every industry, every business, and the whole world. And this is challenging. It's something that affects us personally, and that we don't know yet for how long is it going to be to extend. So with that in mind, we just have to be flexible and adapt, and probably just stop complaining and get moving and be positive and react very fast. So what we did was, aside from taking care of the people and making sure that people were, had everything they needed to be well in their work, wherever that was, at home or in the field. Of course, we had to take a different look at the business, and we cut our CapEx investments by 75%. We were planning to drill 33 wells, which we had already drilled 10 of them, and then we just, got stopped. Rigs go out, people go out, production gets cut down. But it was a great opportunity, and I like to see it as possible. It was a great opportunity to stop, think, review our costs, become a lot more efficient, get lighter in every respect, not in personnel, but we haven't done that kind of reductions, but do a deep review of our plans, of our costs, of our transportations, of our operations, rethink even our technology to have overnight our 300 employees connected. So that was a big challenge. In a couple of weeks, we were up and running. And for that part, we're very grateful to all of our contractors, to all of our employees. And we're not a huge company, we're a medium-sized company, which allows us to make, the decision-making process is very fast. And I can imagine a company like Ecopetrol, the difficulties because of the size that it had, and still everybody reacted. So despite the uncertainty that this creates, there's so much energy in the people trying to make it work. And so we're happy for that. And we see it in all our colleagues and our contractors. Everybody really wants to make it work, and we will.
Eric, do you want to take over?
Yes, thank you, Pedro. Even before the declaration of the pandemic, we have in our company a crisis committee that we had already, having meetings, and then we had decided just to take care of our people. That is our first priority, our people. So we just made a decision to just send about 80% of our employees, which are over 3,000, to work home office from their home. And it was very complex because we had to supply computers, all the stuff, modems, and even internet lines, even the chairs, because ergonomic chairs, because we want everybody just to have, be safe working from home. And the commitment of our people was tremendous, was amazing. Everybody with the morale very high, and we are just handling a daily communication just to keep the morale very high, because as days are flying or passing on, and you don't have personal contact with people, there is a risk that someone starts just to have the morale a little down. So in that regard, talking about our people, we feel like we are in our office, working very efficiently, very safely, and as a result, the operation is doing perfect. On the financial side, of course, we were just working in different simulations of scenarios. What will happen, as this takes longer and longer and longer, which has been taken so far. What about our clients? Many of them they don't have the capacity to pay the bills, to pay the invoices. So we were just working on the projections of different scenarios about our cash flow. And we anticipated to request from several banks some line of credits just for backups. Our company, financially speaking, is very healthy. So far, we are working good, and we haven't had any trouble in that regard. And our ratios, financial ratios that we normally keep in the past, we're just having those ratios as of today. So we were prepared just to face the situation. And if this takes a little longer, we are still prepared just to keep the company very safe financially. On the other hand, we just focus to have a very secure operation, a very safe operation, without any outage, any interruption, or even any accident. So we focus to have the best maintenance. We have around 20% of our personnel working out in the fields, and they are protected with all the elements of protection. But so far also the operation has been running very smooth and very safe. Last, we had to check all our projects. We had some projects, to deploy for this year, and we had to just decide to reduce some of our capex for projects, about 30%, but those were not critical. So once this is done, or we have a better condition to resume those projects, so we'll be more than ready. Last, we were also very eager to support the country. This country, normally we have a very large informal employment. It counts like employment, but it's informal. The guy who sells any fruit in the corner, whatever, in the city. With this lockdown, people are facing troubles, economic troubles, staying home. So we decided to just contribute by supporting the country with donations over $6 million, and for food for the more vulnerable people in the country, and also for some health institutions, in order that they can buy some ventilators for the ICUs. So we felt like we needed to just support the country, and we feel very proud of that. As everybody's saying, nobody expected this to happen. We hope we have an end very soon. But so far, thanks God, our company has been supporting the country, has been supporting our customers. We are in close contact with our customers. Some of them who are not paying, we are just giving facilities to waive options in order to pay, the invoices. So the outcome so far for us has been very satisfactory.
Thank you. Charles.
Pedro, I think Marcela summarized very clearly the impacts on the operations of all oil and gas producers. I think we were all impacted, obviously in the same way to different magnitudes, given various scales. So I won't repeat what Marcela very clearly summarized. Three brief points, concerning Canacol itself. With respect to our business, I think we saw the worst period in April in terms of the depth of the crisis and the impact on production and whatnot. I think that was common to all of us as well. I think the forecast going forward is, most forecasts include some form of a general recovery towards some form of normality throughout the rest of the year. Although there's a lot of uncertainty, of course, with respect to what might come in the so-called second wave potentially. But nevertheless, we had to adjust our production guidance and capital guidance down by about 3% on production and 3% on capital, given our gas business, our gas-focused nature. Two other important points, one of which Eric touched on, very important to us, of course, with respect to the need to work with our customers and our partners, particularly in respect to transportation and gas distribution. There were a lot of issues with the potential of people not being able to, or customers not being able to pay their bills, of course, which was a concern shared by all of the chain and the gas production, transportation, distribution networks. So we worked very carefully with our industry partners, Natural Gas and the ACP, to work together to introduce some flexibility in terms of the contracts that we have amongst ourselves. For example, with respect to transportation contracts that we have with Promigas, with respect to sales contracts that we have to consumers of gas, to introduce some flexibility with respect to payment terms, the deferral of some periods, providing some customers that were under some financial strain the ability to make their payments on a deferred basis. So very carefully working together with all of our partners in a very good way, I might add, assisted by our societies, Natural Gas and ACP, to come to solutions that work for all parts of the supply chain. Second point, which has been very interesting, which I'll talk about very briefly. Obviously, like all other companies in Colombia, 95% of our staff in the office were working remotely from home. And a couple of interesting observations that have come out of that from our perspective. Things generally worked very well. Nothing fell off a cliff in terms of process or getting things done. which led to sort of, a couple of interesting conclusions. We don't really need all of our people to work in the office, is conclusion number one. That has very good impacts for them and from family situations, for example, as well as for us. We have to rent less office space, so that reduces our G&A. And it turns out, given the high degree of connectivity we had and the ability to monitor the use of that connectivity in all its forms, it turns out that some people don't work a lot from home. So we have the ability to really look at people's performance while they're working remotely, and really see if that performance meets our standards, and if those individuals are required in the future in the organization. So it turns out that having part of the staff work remotely from home will have a number of benefits in that A, it reduces our G&A in terms of office space, and B, we can look at reducing headcount as well, getting the job done, same job done with less number of people. So those are sort of the 3 points that have come out of this crisis that we've taken good note of.
Okay, thank you so much, Felipe.
Thanks, Pedro. And a lot of the things that we've done as an industry, I think, have been mentioned by my colleagues, but just like to talk a little bit about Ecopetrol's case in particular. A few things, the second half of last year, we looked at contingency plans. And that actually meant that we could see scenarios where the prices would go down, but we actually saw scenarios where the prices could go up. And what I'm saying is this was so unprecedented and so quick. I think Eric was mentioning nobody saw this coming. I remember being in first week of March in New York, presenting the 2020-2022 business plan, and here we are talking about increasing investments and increasing production as well. And a week later, even before the experiment of having this test to be a weekend in lockdown in Bogota, we send everybody to remote work, and we closed the offices in Bogota. So very, very quickly we had to react. We have now 3 emergency crisis groups working 24/7, one of them for COVID-19 and one of them for the financial side of the business. So what we've done, again, priority number 1, keeping our employees safe. One thing that has been fundamental is how, as we see more and more data and more recommendations at the national level or local level, we can continue to embed those practices, those good practices in our protocols. And I'll share one quick thing here. And actually, during Holy Week, Semana Santa, we had one of our workers died of COVID-19 at the refinery. So we had to very quickly react. We had the help from the National Health Institute, INS. They sent a rapid deployment team, and they looked at protocols. They talked to our people. They gave us a lot of good recommendations in terms of use of air conditioning, for example, and things that would seem normal, but obviously distancing protocols. We shut down some units, but at that stage, the risk was shutting down the refinery, and that basically would have stopped the country. So that's one of the things that we've done, reacted very, very quickly. Testing is fundamental. We're convinced that having PCR testing, we've done, I think, north of 8,000 tests right now as we change shifts, and we have 17% of our people working in the fields and in the stations. But testing is fundamental. And one of the things we need to jointly work as an industry and as a country is how do we increase the capacity of Colombia in terms of testing, the PCR testing. And you see there's a lot of debate in the last few days of, do we have the capacity? We're north of 10,000 tests per day in the country. We need to get a little bit higher. We actually, in less than 4 weeks, installed a molecular biologically lab in our own clinic in Barranca. And that is testing for ourselves, contractors, and community. So I wanted to start with health and safety. And the second thing in health and safety, we're proactively looking for asymptomatic cases. And that's very important, that we understand where the cases are. Second thing, in terms of the business, we stepped on the brakes and we tightened our belts. And this is a different crisis to the one we had before. Previously in 15, 16, the prices dropped, but they recovered very quickly. And I think Marcelo was mentioning, this started as a price war between different producing countries. The prices dropped. And then on top of that, we had COVID-19. And when you have 4.5 billion people in lockdown in the world, demand crashes. So jet fuel demand in Colombia, we were selling 10% of the jet fuel that we would normally sell. Gasoline, we were selling 20 to 30%, diesel 30 to 40%. We had to bring our runs down in the refineries, and we very quickly implemented a financial contingency plan. Increased revenues, that means how can we better sell our crudes in China, for example? Good news, our crudes are considered part of the base runs in the refineries in China. Second one, reducing costs and expenses to the tune of 3.5 trillion pesos right now. We've done that already. Investments, we've gone down from 5.5 billion to 3 billion, very quickly reducing, trying to implement things that don't impact integrity and security and safety of our operations and have the less impact on production and reserves long term. Fourth thing, financing. We need liquidity, and cash protection has been fundamental. So we went out and we actually managed to get north of $3 billion in terms of bonds and some other credit lines. That has been great. So we've been able to protect cash. We've been able to adapt the operation. Right now, we're seeing some recovery. The runs in the refineries are coming up. We're opening more and more work fronts around the country. Drilling rigs, construction projects. We used to have 300 construction projects or fronts in country at any time. We went down to 50 during April. I think Charlie was mentioning April was very, very tough. And if 1Q was complicated, 2Q is going to be more and more complicated. So we're reopening those work fronts. And in that is fundamental that we rebuild trust with the local communities, with the authorities, as we start going back and we can bring people into the shifts and back into operation. This is a time for empathy. This is a time for solidarity. And I think we've seen a lot of that. And finally, one thing that has been mentioned, digital transformation. Over the last 2 or 3 years, we've invested a lot of money in digital transformation. We were forced to go out and work remotely. We had some good tests with the protestas. There was stoppages last year, social protest in Bogota and some other parts of the country. So we worked remotely, and it was a good test. Right now, we have more than 6,000, 7,000 people connected every day. And as Charlie was saying, we know if they're connected, productivity, meetings, messages, technology helps us a lot. And one of the key challenges, I think, going forward is we don't know how long or how deeper the crisis is going to be. How do we actually adapt ourselves to that new way of working remotely? And we've recently done a survey, and a lot of people don't want to go back to the office. They want to stay home. They don't want to commute. They want to be with their kids, and they can be as productive or more productive working remotely. Thanks, Pedro.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. So let me stay with you, Felipe, since you already touched on how different the ongoing oil price crisis is relative to the other. So you touched on a very important topic, okay? And I want to hook up to that answer. If besides working from a contingency mindset point of view, if you can discuss whether you foresee any structural change industry-wise, given what we're going through, right? The combination of a demand side and a supply side crisis. And let me extrapolate on that. So while the price downturn was harsh, your company has been well prepared, balance sheet and cost-wise, and also contingency-wise. So depending on how you answer, what kind of opportunities do you think are surfacing for the company from this crisis, right? For reference, when you look at costs or when you look at the way you think about hedging prices or you allocate capital. And I wanna also extend this question to Marcela on geopower, since we're touching on crude oil specifically.
Thanks, Pedro, and sorry I'm going before you, Marcela, but in terms of demand, and I think one of the things that we don't have certainty on is how quickly demand is going to be recovered. So my take, locally, I think gasoline and diesel will eventually recover at the end of a year. We saw a very big drop, as I was mentioning earlier. So I think recovery will be there at the end of the year. Jet fuel, I think it's going to take much longer. You know, most people, now that they've tested that remote things work, either don't want to travel or think that they don't need to travel. We'll see where that goes. But I think there will be some destruction on demand or of demand going forward. So we'll need to cope with that. Some people say it's going to be 20% worldwide of the 100 million barrels that are used every day, if it's oil, and we'll see. And I think we also have, now having said that, we have a massive opportunity. How can we become a country that provides more gas to its people? You know, I think that's fundamental. Charlie is obviously it's in its vein, you know, it's part of the strategy of his company. How can we provide more gas? You know, there's still probably close to 4 to 5 million people that use wood or coal every day to cook. So how can we become a gassier company? That's a big opportunity, cost-wise, affordability, availability, and in terms of the environment as well. Big opportunity in terms of efficiencies and the digital transformation. So, for example, and I'll give you 2 things that we've done. Our AGM, that normally hosts 5,000 to 6,000 people physically. You know, it's a big event. This year, we did it remotely. This was the time when it was okay to have 500 people together, then 100 people together, then 50 people together, very, very quickly in the days. And we had 8,000 people remotely and 140,000 people through Open TV. And we did the AGM remotely. Or historically, to close our accounts on production, for example, it would take us 2 weeks for 150 people to do that. This last month, we did it 150 people, 3 days remotely. Technology is there. So we're using blockchain to track our molecules from the wellhead to the refineries or the ports. Something that wasn't thinkable before. We're using more bots in our processes, you know. So in terms of technology, I think this is a massive, massive, massive opportunity. I think this sector has been strategic and fundamental to this country for many decades, you know. And we, I think, need to see ourselves as part of that opportunity going forward in terms of ensuring that we can rebound as quickly as we can from the crisis. But I think there's massive opportunity. Some things that we don't need to lose sight of, energy transition, and we're working on that in terms of, for example, generating our own power with renewables, you know, and we're having 5% of our installed capacity is renewables right now. We want to go to 20%, 300 megawatts. I've mentioned about being more gassier, biofuels, technology. You know, we're doing a lot of research in advanced materials, you know. How can we convert the heavier parts of our refining products into better materials? So there's a lot of conversation, and I think from the environmental point of view, not only energy transition, but reduction of the CO2 footprint, reduction of emissions. I think there's massive opportunity in what we can do going forward, Pedro.
Okay. Marcela, do you want to add to the topic?
No, I think like Felipe said, we're doing a lot of what the industry is doing. Of course, we reviewed our cost structure. We worked on our OPEX. We work on our transportation and market costs. We're all, like he said, we're tightening our belts, and we're getting creative, really. We have to think and different marketing structures and how we hedge our production, how we reduce travel here on, how do we change our office space, and so forth, and how are we efficient in keeping the people really connected at the same time that we're distanced. And that is a challenge. I think this is the time where the company cultures are going to be tested, because those bonds have already been built, and they have to be maintained, I don't know for how long, within distance, despite the distance. We see great opportunity, and do you remember that geopark operates in 6 different countries. So we have to deal with 6 different regulatory restrictions and 6 different lockdowns. And what we have learned is that it doesn't matter now where we are. Now we're all connected as if we were in one single company, which we usually were, but we've found to have a great opportunity to share resources, because now we're all leveled. Now it doesn't matter where you are. And this has been a great learning from our crisis. The other thing that we've done is that we are aware of, this is an opportunity for us to make sure that not only we are healthy and financially sound, but that our contractors are. And that our contractors are paying their bills, and that our contractors are getting fairly paid. And thereon that our communities have, because a lot of our communities around are depend in many ways of our operations. And beyond helping them through this crisis, beyond helping them with the, of course, with the medical things and the testings and everything that all of us operators have done in supporting local authorities, we have to ensure that they have means for living. And that goes back to the empathy that Felipe mentioned. We are critical actors in the areas where we operate, and we need to be sure that we continue to be sound, healthy, safe actors, and it's like the vertebral chain of our local communities.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So let me, just for the sake of time, let me shift gears to discuss natural gas as well as a topic. So I'll focus now on Canacol and Promigas. So maybe, Charles, let me start with you. Can we discuss the outlook for natural gas supply, and perhaps we'll leave Eric to discuss a little bit about how he sees supply and demand. But there has been a long debate about a potential shortfall in domestic gas supply, let's say taking a 3 to 5 year view. Meanwhile, the country has reserves and conditions to said the development of new fields, so pending new infrastructure. So can you share your views around the opportunities with the natural gas markets in Colombia?
I think from the supply side, the national agency in charge of studying things such as those things, the UPME, has correctly put together a chart which essentially shows the blowdown of proven gas reserves, and those are reserves associated with producing fields that are currently drilled and producing, yielding a reserve life index of approximately 8 years, which basically means that there's enough reserves to cover production and anticipated production for the remaining 8 years, and then there will be a need to, for massive new reserves to be incorporated. What the UPME, fails to consider with respect to their models are the other categories of reserves, which are probable and possible reserves. These are very important types of reserves. All producers carry these categories of reserves, and these are categories of reserves that are slightly riskier and require capital to develop, to move from probables and possibles into proven. But these are very large numbers we're talking about anyway. So the outlook in a reasonable context is, there are probably more than 10 years of 3P reserves sufficient to sustain current demand. What the UPME also fails to account for is that, their model is essentially a point in time, that at this point in time forward, no additional wells will ever be drilled for gas, which of course is absurd. I mean, people continue to drill for gas. Ecopetrol, Hocal, ourselves all have ambitious plans with respect to drilling for gas. And various organizations such as the ANH and the USGS have identified significant quantities of prospective gas resources onshore and offshore in Colombia, up to 10 times current proven reserves, for example. So, you know, I think that the picture that the UPE has published is a little pessimistic, and it's good to have a pessimistic outlook because that kind of spurs action as well. So I think what really has to be done, and it's something we're very actively lobbying the government on as well, even during this particular crisis, because it does represent an opportunity, is maybe, you know, focus more on accelerating you know, the drilling of these prospective gas resources, both on land and in the offshore. You know, Felipe has, you know, very ambitious plans with respect to drilling in the Caribbean Sea. You know, there are enormous quantities of gas resources identified in the Caribbean that could be very material with respect to providing gas to Colombia for a very long period of time. So I guess my point is, in a nutshell, you know, I think that, you know, demand for gas will continue to increase at a fairly steady rate. Gas is a very important part of the energy transition that the Colombian government is committed to. I think that there are declining proven reserves. That is a worrisome trend, without a doubt. But I do think that there are sufficient probable and possible reserves, as well as enormous prospective resources that can be pursued and captured, especially, you know, with some incentive from the government in order to not only achieve its goal with respect to the place of natural gas in the energy transition, but also, more importantly, to preserve the energy self-sufficiency of Colombia, which is a very important thing to preserve in terms of you know, the cost of energy. So those would be my thoughts.
Eric, do you want to add anything to that?
I agree with all my colleagues in Colombia. We have enough gas, and every company, Canacol, Ecopetrol, Geopark, are working just for that additional supply. We have onshore, we have offshore, and something very important, we have our gas pipelines that connect, you know, across the country, that gas from the oil fields to the main consumptions. And Promigas is always ready to go after those guys. As far, you know, more gas fields are just being produced, we are ready to connect those fields to the main consumptions. So we're ready. But on top of that, also, I don't think we are going to have any scarcity of gas in the country. I don't see it. You know, I feel very, because we have the reserves. So the message to maybe the public, to the consumers, maybe worried a little, but I think we are still with plenty of time just to have that additional production. And these guys are working on that. I trust them very much. But just not to forget, as a complement to that production, we still have the LNG imports. We have in Promigas the regasification site through SPEC, our company located in Cartagena. And even the government is talking about Buenaventura and other regasification site. Maybe that will take a while. I don't see it even before 2024 or 2025. For sure, we're going to have more production for that time, and that might delay that project. But in case something happens, this is a backup as our regasification site in Cartagena. Also, the government has been talking about the possibility of another regasification plant in Guajira, near Orca, where Ecopetrol is just working on the offshore project. So Colombia has plenty of gas. Right now, we are between 3 or 4 teras, but we can jump, you know, once we have either via fracking or offshore or conventional production, whatever, we can be easily over the 60 teras just in 1 or 2 years. So my message is, gas is not an issue. We just need to work. We just need to accelerate the pace to have the production ready. And the companies in Colombia, they're doing a fantastic job. And Promigas has a very strong footprint of gas pipelines on the east loop or west loop of the country. Maybe we need to close some gaps like south of Cordoba and Antioquia, where there's a little gap there. And once this is done, the country in gas pipelines will be as energy, with the agreed of all the lines to transport the gas. So the infrastructure is ready, the production is in our country, and the imports will be always a good option for Colombia in order to complement the production. Not to substitute, but to complement the production of gas in Colombia.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Eric. So for the sake of time, we have time for one last question, and we have like 4 minutes. I have received 3 questions from the audience. Let me, close our panel with a question to Felipe, perhaps, and that would be how would you rank, okay, your assets and investments in Colombia within your or relative to your international portfolio? And when we discuss that, there is an important note, which is the recent investment Ecopetrol has made in the U.S. shale business, and the idea that Colombia will eventually be able to tap into its shale resources and potential reserves. So anything you could comment on that, I would appreciate. We have like 2 or 3 minutes to close.
Well, thanks, Pedro. I'll try to be quick. You know, there's a lot of points in that question. So first thing, in terms of strategy, Ecopetrol looks at Colombia. So 80% of our investments goes into Colombia. As our overall, the aim is to have a break even that's below $30 per barrel. You know, we left last year at $29.90, which is great. 94% of our production is profitable right now. We've had to close some production over the last few months, but as we were talking, recovery is allowing us to bring some of those barrels back into the system. So I think that's good news. So in terms of how do we rank our assets, and this compares or related to the Permian or related to the pre-salt in Brazil or Mexico or the Gulf of Mexico. So we've decided strategically to operate in the continent. That's where we are. We have right now non-operating presence in Brazil and in the US. But linked to something that was mentioned, I think there's a lot of potential in Colombia in the gas. We've recently, through Hocol, started being an offshore operator in Colombia, something that we didn't have in the group in terms of capability. And we see the offshore in terms of gas as a very, very strategic part of everything we'll be doing. Unconventionals, we've gone into the US. We're going to start operations and production this year. Being short cycle, the unconventionals allowed us to start drilling in September last year. So even though it was not part of the plan, we had production and molecules coming from those operations in November and December of last year. Being a short cycle, we can adapt and we can adjust the level of investment. So we've basically reduced the level of investment from 800 million this year to 180, 200 million. But the good news, even though we've cut CapEx by 75%, our production has only gone down by 50%. So we already have some very healthy production coming from the unconventionals in the Permian in the US. And as soon as the prices will ramp up again, and we're seeing some recovery of prices right now, we'll be ready to restart. And it's critical because that knowledge and technology transfer we're gaining in that operation with our partner, we can bring it back to Colombia. Colombia has a massive opportunity in the unconventionals. We are convinced it's strategic. And, you know, the ANH mentioned a few days ago, Armando Zamora was saying that probably September, October, they'll be basically awarding the areas where the pilots will be done in Colombia. So I think we'll see that. We've said we want to be transparent. We want to operate in the fishbowl, everybody looking in, having the data real time, using blockchain to provide data back to technology, to the communities. But it's an opportunity the country cannot let go. There's massive resources in gas, in the unconventionals, as there's in the conventionals. Can we blow down Cusiana and Cupiagua? You know, Can we reduce the flaring and put those molecules of CO2 back as methane into the systems? Can we be more efficient and use less gas in the refineries? There's so much at stake. So bottom line, reduce break even, be below 30, keep our production profitable, learn from the operations outside, in the pre-salt in Brazil, in the offshore, in both in the US and in Mexico, and in the unconventionals, and bring that back. And Colombia will continue to be the focus of our strategy. Around 80% of our investments going forward will be here. We've mentioned we have a fundamental role to play in recovery and as part of being the backbone of this country. Thanks, Pedro.
Very good. Very good. So we are a minute over time here, and I'm going to close this panel. It was a pleasure to have you all here with me, and on behalf of BBC and Citi, I couldn't thank you more. I really appreciate your comments, your remarks. I will forward you a couple of the questions that I have received from the audience, so you can reply to them directly. Thank you so much for participating today.
Thank you, Pedro. Best wishes to you all.
Best
Thank
wishes.
you all. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Pedro. Thanks, everyone.
Charlie,
seeing you.
very nice seeing you.
Likewise. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Have a great day.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to our session today. I'd like to begin by welcoming my panelists and thanking them for joining me in today's very relevant discussion on the question of whether it is time for a green recovery. Our panelists come from some of the most significant companies in Colombia and undoubtedly have many interesting and valuable perspectives to share with us today. Quickly to introduce them, we have with us Camilo Abello from Grupo Argos, the largest cement company in Colombia, an energy company, an infrastructure company, and a real estate company. We have Alejandro Sanchez from Corfico Colombiana, also a holding company with investments in agro-industry, hotels, infrastructure, and energy. And last, we have Guillermo Gonzalez from ISA, an energy company with the largest transmission grids in Colombia and Peru, as well as infrastructure business line, telecommunications, and management of the electricity exchange. Before I turn over to my panelists, I'd like to just reflect briefly on where we are, the situation we find ourselves in. I find myself somewhat skeptical of anyone who suggests that they know what our post-COVID world is going to look like. But I think there are three things that we can be sure of, which are relevant to our discussion today. The first is that the economic impact of this pandemic will be severe, perhaps more severe than any of us have experienced in our lifetimes. Despite the extraordinary measures taken by governments, NGOs, individuals, and civil society at large, the fallout will be significant. The OECD estimates that under some scenarios, we will see a global GDP decline of more than 7%. The speed of the recovery is uncertain and unfortunately driven by factors outside of our control. The second thing we can be sure of is that during this crisis, firms with better ESG performance have outperformed their counterparts. This is demonstrated in relative market outperformance as well as lower volatility. But this actually extends beyond the crisis. A recent Morningstar study looking at back over 3, 5, and 10 years found that in general, ESG funds performed better than the alternative and tended to survive longer than other funds. And the third thing we can be sure of is that this crisis presents us not just with enormous risk, but also literally a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. The President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, recently promised to put the European Green Deal at the center of the EU's recovery plan. Specifically, she said, by using the European Green Deal as our compass, we can turn the crisis of this pandemic into an opportunity to rebuild our economies differently and to make them more resilient. So this leads us nicely into our discussion today, and I'd like to begin by asking my panelists what impact, if any, the last few months have had on their thinking about their business. How have you responded in the short term? What are some of the immediate things you've done? As well as how has it reshaped your thinking about the future and the role of business in society? Alejandro, let me begin with you.
Sure. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you, Shoban, for the panel. Let me talk a little bit briefly about the question. Well, in our case, most of our businesses sit at the backbone of the economy. What we do, as you mentioned before, is infrastructure, transportation, natural gas distribution, services that in general provide a network for the economic activity and the livelihoods of millions of people. The companies we invest in are present in most of the regions in Colombia and are very important for the rural economy. So situations like this one that we're living right now, market disruptions such as the one, are rare, but are times that represent an enormous challenge for businesses, the businesses that we have. But they also are an opportunity to realize the full impact of the footprint that our company has in the economy. So what we have done, and this situation is interesting because it was so sudden and forceful that it brought us to take serious decisions and to test our moral and corporate compass in the sense of deciding what was important. And in our case, the first and foremost was to safeguard our communities, the health of our employees, our families, customers, suppliers, and all the regions we operate. So that was our first goal, and it still is to safeguard our communities. On the second place is just to manage the service continuity. As I mentioned before, what we do is central to most industries, to industries, to commerce, to agriculture. So a responsibility that we have to the country and to the economy is to continue our service and to provide the network of energy and transportation, even in the restrictions that we face right now. So that was the second measure that we tried to pursue. On third place, this is more of a corporate part, but we wanted to maintain liquidity in all of our businesses. Part of the sustainability is to make sure that you can operate in the long term, and for that you have to make sure that you are able to meet your commitments. So liquidity was important. But what is important in these three aspects that I just mentioned is that the short answer to your question is yes. We realized in this situation that we have an important impact, and we have reviewed our priorities, and we have set forth the main priority, which is the people in our communities, and that's very important in business decisions. So that's one of the key messages that we have so far got from this crisis. On the other side, on the business side, we invest in sectors that generally are considered important, sectors that are regulated, stable, long-term oriented. We don't have investments in market trends or in highly technological businesses with large returns. But situations like these really are a test to the investment thesis that we have had for a long time, and we are reaffirmed on the idea that we prefer to be sustainable in the long run rather than be fast-growing and volatile. So the short answer to your question is yes. We have realized that we have a deep impact. We have put people first, and we have reaffirmed our business model. And in that sense, this situation is an important one, and it will be in the coming discussions for the future of our company.
Fantastic. Camila, let me turn over to you and ask you the same question. Are there things you've done in the short run, and has it caused you to sort of rethink some of the things that you're doing?
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation and for being here in the panel. As you may know, and most of the listeners, Grupo Argos is a Colombian-based group of companies in different businesses, infrastructure, as you said at the beginning, cement and ready-mix, and also power generation, and some real estate also investments. We are living very difficult times. This is unforeseen for everybody. We have taken measures in 3 different lines. First, our most important resource, which is people, our people, the safety of our people, and that line also trying to maintaining jobs, which is good for them, for the company, for us, and for the economy. Second line is taking control of the cash in the company, securing credit lines, and also putting all the investments, CapEx, OpEx in review, the opportunity for those investments, and trying to postpone whatever could be postponed. And the third line is immediate actions during this so-called crisis, and also business continuity, and learning how to operate through this pandemic. But that's one group of measures, and at that same time, a different group. That first group of actions, I mean, is being led in our company by top officials. But there's another group at the same time thinking the post-COVID world, what's going to happen. And we're trying to make reflections, opinions, comments regarding what's going to be the world after the pandemic. And in that scenario, what we are thinking is, can we anticipate any trends? Can we identify trends, and what we can do from our businesses to navigate those trends? And at the same time, what is the role of our business in society? And we have realized that we have a very important role in society. Our businesses touch every part of the life of many people, and we have decided that to take more actions regarding the impact of our operations. We have been doing that for the last decade, but that's really important in the future. That's why ESG criteria has been reinforced in our company.
Fantastic, thank you. And Guillermo, maybe if I can turn it over to you.
Yeah, sure. Well, first, let me tell you a little bit about ISA, because we are a multi-Latin company group with more than 52 years of experience, recognized for its excellence in our operation in energy, roads, and telecommunications, as you said, but we have operations in Colombia, Brazil, Chile, Peru, Bolivia, and Argentina, as well as in Central America, through the work of nearly 4,000 employees and 43 affiliate subsidiaries. The pandemic situation in recent months has, of course, made us reflect, analyze, and redirect some of our actions. It's been essential to us to emphasize the relevance of our role as a company in society, to understand that we must present results and we take over the impacts of our operations on society and environment. COVID-19 has challenged us as individuals, as companies, as humanity, and has confirmed that our well-being is linked to that of other people. Now we know that co-responsibility, solidarity, and awareness are not an option. They're the only way to succeed and convene and overcome this situation. Now, in order to face this moment, we have adopted several measures to protect the life and integrity of our people, suppliers, and contractors, as well as our employees. And we have also ensured the efficiency and reliability of our services. It's been very important to strengthen those capabilities to meet our strategy 2030, such as adaptability, flexibility, networking, and of course, the culture of digital transformation. In the same way, it's been confirmed for us that our strategy, the ISA Group strategy, which is summarized in the sentence, sustainable value creation was designed, in which we designed our route for 2030 through 3 pillars, is still valid. And those 3 pillars are generating value for the shareholders, ensuring corporate validity, and create a social and environmental impact. So as Alejandro was saying, to make the answer short, of course, we've been thinking about our business and our role in this society, because we believe by impacting so many countries and so many users throughout the region, we have a lot of commitment to them, and we need to behave in the best way possible, being the best corporate citizen as possible.
Thank you for that, all of you. And what's interesting to me is the sort of immediate short-term focus on preserving the health and well-being of employees, customers, contributing in whatever way people can in that regard, but then also using this as an opportunity to think, well, what does this mean for our organization and the role our organization plays going forward? And linking that back to value creation within the firm, because it's obviously critically important that these things are tied together, that one doesn't think of sustainability as being divorced from how the firm operates as a profitable entity over the longer term. So perhaps that leads us then into the next question, which is, so we're going through this pandemic, we're having to manage the immediate effects of the pandemic, which is sort of questions of resilience, questions of ensuring the health and safety of the people who are working there, but also new realizations about perhaps a different perspective on the world and the role of the company within that world. Are there specific things, well, firstly, do you agree with the proposition that we should use this moment to move to a green recovery? And if so, are there specific things that you're already thinking about or planning on doing that might support a green recovery, whether that's investing more in renewable energies, more resilient infrastructure, any other examples you might have? Guillermo, let me start with you, seeing as I left you to last the last time.
Okay, well, yes, of course, we do agree, and because we strongly believe it will be the only way to ensure that we will have a sustainable planet. The pandemic has brought great challenges, and will leave economic and social consequences throughout the planet. However, every crisis brings with it a series of opportunities. And these events will allow us to prepare for future shocks with new ways that go beyond the status quo. The recovery from the crisis should lead us to a different economy, towards something better. We need to promote the sustainable well-being of the people and the environment. In environmental matters, there's a principle of no regression, as you all know, since a situation like this should not represent a setback to all the achievements that we have accomplished and that are already being made. But on the contrary, we must be more resilient to climate change and other challenges to which we face. The situation will bring us a lesson of more awareness about caring for others, caring for the planet, and using our resources efficiently. In ESA, our roadmap, we believe that our roadmap should be the 2030 agenda and the 17 sustainable development goals. Now, as to what we have done, well, as I mentioned before, our strategy is the sustainable value creation and is the center of our strategy. And we have 4 main elements we seek to be present in our operation, one of which is green, or being eco-friendly, having innovation, development, and of course, promoting, and this is very important, partnership. We have done many things. I'm gonna just mention a couple. For instance, on our energy, transport, and engineering and design, for example, when we design the layout of a transmission line, we seek to minimize the impact on the nearby communities and biodiversity. And we have put it, ESG, as a very important issue when assessing when to go to a bidding, or when we have already won a project and we are designing these lines. We are also entering, as I said before, on partnerships in an alliance with a company in Brazil that it's called Drone Power. with whom the sophistication, I mean, we have brought new technologies in order to maintain the energy transport assets. And so we're able to diagnose, go much faster, much effectively to repair these lines by assuming this partnership and having the conscience that by implementing technology, we will really diminish the impact on ESG. We also have a very important program. I'm going to maybe stop there because I know time is of the matter. And we have a very important program that I like to mention that we have had for 5 years, but we're enhancing and use it very much at this moment, that it's called Conexión Jaguar or Jaguar Connection, which is the sustainable program which contributes to the ISA's sustainable program, which contributes to biodiversity conservation, climate change mitigation, development of rural communities, and the connectivity of the jaguar's natural habitat in Latin America. This program fosters the development of forest sustainable restoration and conservation in projects carried out in Colombia, Peru, Brazil, and Chile. And so on and so forth. We do believe that we're making as many possible things in order to really contribute in this green recovery, which we believe is the only way to go. I mean, I don't think there's a single, or there might be a few humans that are not convinced that we should profit from this moment, right? We have accomplished so much. We've seen animals going through the cities. We've seen clearer waters around the world. We've seen biodiversity being recovered. How cannot we, and this by making decisions that were to preserve the human's health, not to actually enhance the green recovery. So if we make some decisions to enhance this green recovery, and of course, never falling into the trap of the dichotomy of recovering the economics or the green recovery, but knowing that one and the other really interacts. I mean, we really need to know that we are in the best possible moment in order to go through that path.
Fantastic, and thank you for I could see your passion and commitment to this coming through there. Thank you for that. Alejandro, let me turn to you here and ask you a similar question. Is this the moment for a green recovery? And if so, what are you specifically looking at in order to support this?
Sure. Of course, I support Guillermo's position, and I think the situation that we're living right now is a clear driver of change. I would say, following your question, even more than green recovery, I would consider that a sustainable recovery, in the sense that we are learning in very difficult steps that what is good for the world is good for us, and what is good for our neighbor is good for us as well. And we've heard this all over the news, but the whole restraint, the whole lockdown is a proof that by taking care of each other, we're actually taking care of us. And that's a metaphor that is adaptable as well to the corporate environment. What we have seen is that we operate in communities. We operate in several regions. We operate in regions where there is almost no government presence. So those communities where we work are actually our life, and we depend on them, and they depend on us. So we have this relationship where we really have been shown that we are just one single community, business community, and the people where we work. So I fully support the idea that this crisis is the driver for change, for a more sustainable business development. What we are doing and what we are realizing in this pandemic is that it is not two different parties of an equation. It is just one large party, the business and the communities where they operate. We are starting to develop new ties with the communities as well as as was mentioned before by Camilo, one of our main goals has been to preserve employment and to preserve the livelihoods of people. And we have been shown that turns back in a positive way to us. So we are committed to development of those communities where we work in. We're committed to education. We have had plans to foster education in the communities where we operate, but we are strengthening that. We have also an important commitment to environment in some of the regions, and it's worthwhile to mention that some of our operations are agribusiness that sit in the really far out places in Colombia, where we are the only means to survive and to provide their support to those communities. So we have this symbiotic relationship with them, and we're going to keep strengthening that and really provide for a better ties with community. Regarding some more corporate initiatives, of course, we're committing to developing these reporting standards to see how that develops over time. We started to do that some years ago, but we're keep on improving that. And one of the main goals that we have right now is to make this sustainable concept that also includes the green that you mentioned, part of our DNA, part of the core values that we carry where we go and that we evaluate in every single investment that we pursue in the future. So yes, I think it is time to make a change, to use this crisis as an opportunity for more sustainable businesses. And the main driver is that the deep impact that this crisis is having in companies is going to make it have a deep imprint in the corporate DNA that we have.
Fantastic. And I mean, I like this idea that one has to sort of start to internalize these issues and think about what do these mean for our business conduct, business practices, how we actually do business, and also use it as a way of identifying where the opportunities are, because I think that's the other side of it. There are genuine opportunities associated with this new direction. Camilo, let me turn over to you then and ask how you're looking forward and what the sort of specific things are that you might be doing to support a green recovery.
Yes, I agree. I concur. A green transition is a must. The challenges we live as a humanity are bigger than the pandemic, bigger than the deep economic crisis that we're living, and climate change is there. It's a reality, and we need all together work, governments, countries, we as individual businesses, I mean, society in general. And we, as a humanity, again, we are not doing a good job. We're losing that. And the challenge is, I mean, as I said, bigger than the pandemic that we're suffering. In that regards, we believe that is in the center of our business strategy all the measures related to sustainability, not only the environmental ones, but also social and governance practices. And that leads us to our value creation. ESG, I mean, there are so many business opportunities that take us to value creation. So not only because we have the conviction that this is good for the future, to leave to our future generations a better planet, but also it's good for the businesses. And there's an intimate connection in that value creation and also doing what is right. And we believe that first, we need to take actions at a personal level. All as individuals, we have to lead by example and doing things in a normal life. This pandemic have shown to us is we were traveling, we were working different cities, and that maybe is not the best idea. Now we can communicate in this kind of a virtual scenarios, maybe in a very efficient way without the emissions related to traveling. Human contact is necessary. We need to interact. Social is in our nature as a human beings, but sometimes we could be more efficient in a different operating in a different way. In that green recovery, I mean, there are many actions that a company could do. We have taken several steps not only because of the pandemic. It's our strategy, as I said, for a long time. For example, we have a value-added statement in which we measure what we give or contribute to the society, and also we measure what we have taken from society, our negative impact against our positive impact, and we have numbers, and it came up good in our company. But this is an important tool, and the base of that tool in any company could be a risk analysis, because at the end it's a way to measure what we have done and what we can do in the future. For example, I mean, our carbon footprint. We take a number for that according to international standards, and then we measure that against our positive impacts. At the end, our result is it is positive. So for the last year, so we are contributing more than we are taking from society. But that measure, that value-added statement, is a very important tool that we can use in order to to take decisions, to anticipate risk, to understand trends. But again, also, all the sustainability actions that we have taken are in intimate and close connection to our strategy. And that's why we believe that there is a business opportunity, and there's value creation for our shareholders, our investors in that regard.
Thank you very much, Camilo. And I was interested that people that we brought up the topic of biodiversity, because I think that's something that companies don't necessarily, it's a systemic thing. It's a bit like climate change, and companies don't necessarily think about their contribution to biodiversity. But what this pandemic has shown is that loss of biodiversity, deforestation, is one of the things that is contributing dramatically to the rise of zoonotic diseases, right? Diseases that come from animals that come out into humans. And so, this getting to grips with this matters for all of us in a meaningful way. And I've seen investors, large investors globally, increasingly pick up on this issue of biodiversity and wanting to know what companies are doing, what impacts they're having on biodiversity. So I think that's very salient. Let me go now to, well, before I move on, I just like to encourage, I don't know who my audience is. It's very strange not to be able to look out and see an audience, but just to encourage the audience members who are there, if you have any questions, please do send them through. We will be breaking 15 minutes before the hour to pass on any questions you may have. I think you should know how you can do that. But just to carry on, so as I mentioned at the outset, in other parts of the world, we've seen very strong calls on government to build back better, to build back greener, to say emphatically, we don't want to go back to what we had before. This is a real chance to do something different. And in some places, we've seen businesses asking government to do this specifically, or government coming out and saying this themselves. So I guess my question to each of you is, do you see a need for a similar type of approach in Colombia? Is there an ask that you would have of government to support a green recovery? Or is there a challenge you put out to other companies like yourselves in terms of getting part of this? How do you sort of see this moving forward? And Camilo, I'll start with you.
Thank you. Yes, let me add, before talking about government, let me add a couple of actions that we have done in order to contribute to the green, I would like to say, transition. And in our voluntary actions, we have planted more than 5 million trees, and as a business, not related to our mandatory compensations regarding our permits and authorizations in regards. No, that's in the other side, in the voluntary compensation field, which is really important, because Colombia, as you said, has a large, very important biodiversity, and Colombia could be destiny for a voluntary compensation for for governments and also companies are all around the world. And we have been working in that regards. And our nonprofit foundation is dedicated to preserve and maintain our biodiversity. And it could be a good opportunity to partner up with any major institution or company that would like to join us in the task to preserve our biodiversity. And related to government in Colombia, and I believe Guillermo Alejandro will concur in this, the government is focusing on the economic recovery, which is right, is good. They are doing a good job working on that. It's difficult, but they are concentrated in the immediate economic recovery and also in all related health issues first. Colombia was in the past very active in the international field regarding the climate change and international policies and also the COP21, etc. But we believe that the government could do more in order to promote these kind of voluntary compensation issues and also to help business to have a green transition. I mean, support could be done in different ways, not only subsidized, but also incentives. And that could be good. Not all the businesses need that, but as a country, I believe that more incentive, it could be important. In our company, we have in our power generation and in our energy company, we have an important part of the portfolio is related to renewables. So we are working already in that. In our cement work, for example, and as another example of a business opportunity related to green transition, we have launched recently green cement. This is a cement produced with a lower impact related to air emissions, carbon emissions. That's a lower footprint. And it's a product which is done by our innovation strategies and also by the conviction that is where it's right and have been taken by the market, with really good expectations. So to summarize, I believe the countries should do more rather than regulate and to control businesses in the field of promoting and giving incentive to a green transition.
Fantastic, thank you, Camilo. And I think that that sort of message of steering companies in the right direction, providing them with sort of support and direction is great. Guillermo, do you want to perhaps come in here and offer some perspectives on this question? How do we get everyone involved in this green recovery?
Well, first of all, I would like to make the acknowledgement that, of course, I agree with Camilo, but I would like to acknowledge that the Colombian government has done a very fast and structured plan to confront what might be the biggest health and economic crisis of recent times. Now, regarding this new phase where countries are reopening and governments are building the basis for the economic recovery, the investment framework must consider the social, environmental challenges of our time, such as climate change and biodiversity, or biodiversity loss, and that we need to be resilient and adapt our infrastructure to that. We need timely regulation to develop competitive projects that deliver the best social and environmental practices, generating positive impacts and innovative solutions, I believe. I think we saw, as I said before, decisions being made in record time due to the crisis. But we're also living in a climate crisis where the registry of average temperature are breaking records constantly, and the numbers of extreme events are increasing. We need to accelerate the decisions regarding the use of these new technologies that we have that will allow us to contribute to the mitigation and adaptation of the climate change. Now, if I would need to ask something from my government, which I rather say recommend, is please take decisions very rapidly, as you have done. It's been shown and proved that we can take politics out of these kind of decisions that we need to make. And please put the planet, biodiversity, and ESG first when taking these decisions. Now, regarding the challenges that I might have for the companies, I would say, let's articulate. That's a challenge that I made. We cannot still be working individually. We need to articulate to improve the results and minimize the impacts to society and environment. Secondly, I would say invest in science, technology, and innovation. It's the best way to really accomplish our goals as human beings in this planet that is being deteriorating. And please, the third one would be develop your operations in a very sustainable way. It's profitable to do so. I would like to tell you that in fact, ISA has been able to issue green bonds in Peru and Brazil, very well accepted, demanded 5.7 times, which show that if you behave the right way, investors will come to you and will acknowledge that and will pay for that. They want to engage with companies that are having this kind of behavior. So do not be afraid of, then again, act as a corporate citizen and do act, and of course, do accomplish your obligations to your fiduciary obligations with your shareholders, but you do also have a very strong obligation with humanity. So please do conduct your business in a very sustainable way.
Fantastic, thank you. And the point about the green bond market is a very interesting one. The sort of green finance market is growing dramatically. We're seeing a lot of investor interest in green bonds, sustainability bonds. There have been COVID bonds during this period. There are definitely opportunities for the right kinds of companies with the right kind of projects to tap into these markets and this investor community. Alejandro, let me turn to you. What are you going to challenge your fellow companies to do, or encourage government to do to support this green recovery?
Well, I think aside from the good intentions that everyone has, we have to understand each company's place in the business landscape and what we can do to improve sustainability. As the other important companies represented here, we, Coffee Colombiana, we are an important investment company. We invest a lot of money every year in different initiatives. So one of the things that we did recently was to sign our investment declaration, where we make a public commitment to include ESG factors in every investment decision that we make. And I think through publicizing this and then making this a public statement, we send a message to every possible venture and project that we care for environment, and we not only care, but we're going to evaluate it and take it into account in our business decisions. So I think we have the responsibility to start shaping the business decisions and include environment and social criteria amongst our decision variable. Also, I'm following your comment on the green bonds. We're fostering the issues of our carbon reduction bonds, and we've done that in some of our agribusiness deals, and that's been a very profitable side of the business, while also contributing to the better planet. So that is something that we are also very keen to explore and to enhance. Every initiative that we can, following green or carbon reduction bonds, that is something that we're strongly targeting. As well as was mentioned by Camilo, we're also committing to the preservation of natural environments aside from what we're mandated to. I think that's part of our responsibility. On the social front, I think it's very important to realize that we all work within communities, and communities in countries such as Colombia are very underprivileged. So there has always been a tension between business and communities that hasn't been always resolved in the best of ways. Part of our commitment and what we should do is to be better in that and to provide for better solutions and relationship between companies and the communities where they work on. If I would ask something from the government, is also to keep on pushing for greener technologies. We have some initiatives and we have tax incentives and things that are a good idea to promote greener technologies, but I think we could do better on that. We could provide for better incentives and try to bring more investment as it has been in other countries and in other moments in time. So I think we can do better on the business side. We have to commit ourselves and we have to do it publicly. We have to provide for people to understand that this is not just a fashion or something out of our just what we do in our spare time, but also to get that same mood from the government saying, we need you to do this in a greener way, in a more sustainable way. We need you to have a better relationship with the communities. We need to have this relationship working as a partner relationship between environment, communities, and companies. And that is something that we are actively pursuing in all of the business that we develop, not only in the infra business, but also in the agribusiness and even in the energy business.
Having to unmute myself. Thank you for that. So as we think about this, I haven't seen any questions come in, which could be a failure on my part to navigate the technology, but I'm having fun talking to you, so I'm just going to keep going, and the audience can hopefully still reach us with questions if they have them. As we move to a more sophisticated understanding, away from sort of notions of corporate social responsibility into genuinely internalizing issues of sustainability into the business and business operations and business thinking, one of the challenges that we have to think about as corporates is how do we communicate that? How do we communicate that out to the various stakeholders who are interested in what it is that we're doing? And as we know, there are sort of a range of different reporting frameworks and standards, like, for example, GRI and SASB, as well as rankings and raters like the Dow Jones Sustainability Index. So how do you, Alejandro, think about best communicating what you do and navigating these this variety of reporting frameworks, standards, rankings, ratings, etc.?
You're right. I think it is a challenge. We have these different reporting standards. We're in the process of not only giving importance to sustainability, but also trying to comply with different ideas of reporting. We actually started to do that for the past 3 years. We've been reporting in GRI. We recently studied as well with Dow Jones. In some cases, they meet the criteria, some others don't. So you're right in the sense that it would be beneficial to have a clear standard for everyone to follow and to comply. So that's one desirable that we should get at some point. Right now, a company such as ours is trying to follow the holes in every, at least 2 or 3 different reporting standards. That is something that we're working on, and I think that has to be improved at a market level. It's not just a single company that can do something about that. To enhance that and to try to fill in some of the gaps that we feel are there is exactly what I mentioned before, the public declaration that we signed, saying we're not only just going to comply with some standards and provide some additional reporting, but we are going to do a public statement on what we think is important and in what particular way sustainability impacts our business, and we think we can make a change. And again, in our view, a company that makes investments has to have an investment policy that really accounts and commits to ESG. As well as IRR or any financial metric that you consider, we have to consider ESG metrics, and that's the way we're considering. So ideally, if we could get to some place where we have one single standard would be better. But while we get there, I think we have to do our own work and do some public standards on what we do internally.
Thank you, Alejandro. And before I pass this on to the others, because I would like to hear your responses, I have had a question come in, which is quite a technical question, in the sense that it's quite precise. So one of the questions is, obviously banks have been quite severely impacted during this crisis period, which means that they face liquidity constraints and limits on their ability to lend. What are the implications of that for how you're thinking about financing renewable energy or other type of sustainability projects that you may have going forward? Are you looking at tapping the capital markets? Where does the funding for this come from? And Guillermo, I can't tell if you're looking worried at this question or
Very much, because I am not a finance expert or really capable to actually answer that question in the best possible way for the person asking the question. I need to acknowledge that I'm not the right person to answer.
That's totally fine. Camilo, let me turn over to you and see if you have a perspective on this. So Camilo, I think you're on mute.
Yeah, sorry. Let me put it this way: the Colombian bank system, is strong, have been able to provide liquidity to the market. But linking that to the sustainability work, what we believe is, in the green transition, there are two keys. Efficiency means lower cost, not only in operation, but also in finance cost on financing. Sustainable loans, for example, is a trend, and this is already there. Better interest rate for companies that have good practices, ESG meaning, and also green bonds and green financing. I believe there's a trend that is going to be bigger and bigger, and we believe that this is a good path for a company. That's the word of efficiency, and in the same time, the good recovery is related to a strategy, which leads us to the value creation and business opportunities. That's why every company has to mix both as a center of the strategy. As I said at the beginning, we have been able to obtain credit lines in order to navigate this crisis, secure the credit lines. We don't have any problem. During the crisis, we issue bonds. Celsia, our energy company, during the restrictions, had a successful emission of bonds, what we call it like virtual emission, which really good during this time. So financial markets are always there, and my view is we will see more related to green and sustainable loans.
That's great. And while I have you, let me then ask you the reporting question and how you navigate this reporting landscape.
I guess sometimes could be overwhelming. Different frameworks, but for us the key is transparency. The more that we communicate is good for our shareholders, good for the stakeholders, good for our investors. And we believe that despite that we don't have a unique framework yet, there are good initiatives. So we have taken GRI and we measure our sustainability or assess our sustainability efforts with the Dow Jones index. We are part of the index. We are leading in our industry. We are part of the global index, and we're a leader in our industry. For a long time now. But transparency is really important. And we believe that we need to, as a business society, we need to have a universal or unique framework that is common to and useful for all investors. But meanwhile we get there, transparency is important, and we need to communicate more. And we have been done that. There are very good initiatives out there. I mean, as you said at the beginning, and what could be confusing is different investors take different paths in order to better understand what the companies are doing, and those paths are different measures, and we need to work on that. I mean, in the relation with investors and companies, but that's not a problem when we believe in transparency and you're willing to communicate even more.
Thank you. I think that point is so important. This need to actually communicate with one's investors and understand what it is they're looking for and what it is specifically that they are concerned about. And sometimes that aligns with what the company is focused on, and sometimes it doesn't. But it's about having that dialogue, and as you say, being transparent about what you're doing to enable that dialogue to happen. So Guillermo, I'm sure this is a question you are more comfortable with. Yeah. So I'm going to hand over to you and ask you again the sort of reporting frameworks, the standards, the various indices that are out there. How do you manage that?
Well, actually, we, as my partner said, we're also part of the Dow Jones Sustainability Index, and we're also being evaluated by FTSE4Good in Britain. We do use GRI methodology in order to ensure that there's a common language, that it's understandable for investors and for global corporations. So we're all talking and speaking the same language. And we also believe, and we have been awarded for that the transparency is the most important thing. And not only because people will charge you if you are not transparent, but also because it's the only way in which you will actually see where can you improve and where you should improve by using these measurements. Now, if I could build in what Alejandro and Camilo have said so eloquently, I would say that maybe something that I will recommend when doing this is that these indexes will actually be very useful to measure your results, but are not that useful to actually see what impact are you actually doing with what you're doing. So it is very important to find, and there are certain tools such as externalities, for instance, that are useful in order to actually measure the impact that you're actually doing when you're performing your different social, environmental, economic actions.
Wonderful. So we are at time, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. I'd just like to reflect. I mean, I think one of the things that we've all, that certainly all of us on this call or this the seminar panel realize is that, you know, this COVID pandemic, as terrible as it has really been, in some senses, kind of a test run for the big one, right? Which is climate change, and which is coming, and we know is going to be, the impacts are going to be significant unless we start moving much faster and doing much more than we've been doing up until now. And I think the other thing it's highlighted, somebody made the point about, you know, looking forward, getting better at looking at the trends, at what's coming. One of the things I've been seeing increasingly is investors are increasingly focused not just on individual ESG issues, but on systemic issues. What are the things that are not within the domain of a single company, but that emerge as a result of the interaction of the behavior of a series of companies? And I think this is the next big area that people are going to be concerned about. Climate change is the big systemic externality. We've mentioned biodiversity loss as another one, inequality, racial inequality, as we've seen coming on the back of the George Floyd events, and then the George Floyd murder, and then the protests around the world. So all of these are issues, I think, that increasingly people are trying to grapple with, and we're getting more sophisticated tools that allow us to assess them better. And I think, you know, it's heartening to see that large companies that have such large impact are thinking seriously about how we grapple with this as we go forward. So ordinarily, I would look out into the audience and ask everyone to thank me for having such a fantastic set of panelists. I can't do that, so please take my warmest gratitude for your time today, for participating in today's session. I'd also like to thank our hosts for having us here today and giving us this opportunity to have this conversation. And I wish you all a wonderful and productive rest of your day. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Owen. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.